In my last lecture, I gave you a shockingly brief introduction to Hinduism and Buddhism, focusing especially on some of the beliefs they share. Just to recap, both religions have an essentially cyclical view of history and spiritual reality. Individuals are caught up in a cycle of rebirth driven by their karma, or the justice of their actions. Buddhism's iconic symbol shown here is the Dharma Wheel, or the wheel of karmic justice. Buddhist and Hindu worship patterns both focus heavily on circumnavigation, circling around an image in imitation of the cycle of life and the turning of the heavens. So how does this contrast with the Christian worldview that has shaped Western culture? How do Christians and Westerners view history and the passage of time? Well, Westerners are much more linear in our thinking. Creation is a beginning in time, and history, personal history and world history, progresses forward from there. Christians, as well as Jews and Muslims, share with Buddhists and Hindus a belief that what we do in this life determines our eternal destiny. But generally, they believe that we only get one shot at getting it right. To understand Hinduism and Buddhism, we need to try to get inside this cyclical view of the natural and spiritual world. And I think this image of Shiva as Naranja, the Lord of the Dance, is a great place to begin, not least because it is one of the most iconic of Hindu images. This image is filled with complex iconography, and we'll get there in a minute, but it also tells a story. I hope you had a chance to watch this last class. If not, the link is up on Moodle. You can guess what stories these images tell, right? David slaying Goliath, Noah loading up the ark, shepherds viewing baby Jesus in the manger. When you see these images, it conjures up a familiar narrative in our minds. The same would be true of Hindu images for men and women who were raised on these religious narratives from childhood. So, let's briefly recap the Shiva narrative. Note that not all of this was in the cartoon version. There are a lot of variations on this story. Shiva came to the forest to confront a group of sages, or wise men, who had been neglecting proper worship. The sages sent a series of creatures to attack Shiva. First they sent a tiger, which is how Shiva ended up wearing a tiger skin. Then they sent a monstrous snake, which Shiva turned into a necklace. And finally they sent an evil dwarf, and Shiva made short work of him as well. With all of his foes defeated, Shiva began his creative and destructive dance. And here's where we see the cyclical worldview of Hinduism. Shiva is a creator, a preserver, and a destroyer, a triple identity that makes sense when rebirth always follows and indeed requires death to preserve the circle of life. This 17th century hymn sums up Shiva's 5 sacred actions, also highlighted in the sculpture. Note that all of his roles are displayed on the image. He creates the world with his sacred drum, he protects creation with his hand upraised in the do not fear mudra, and he destroys with the hand that bears the sacred fire. This slide gives you some close-ups of the iconography of the work. The circle of flame surrounding Shiva, or the nimbus, symbolizes the boundaries of the cosmos, while the fire he bears in his hand destroys samsara, the cycle of rebirth, and maya, illusion. The dwarf, representing this illusion that leads humankind astray, is trampled under one foot, while with another lifted foot, Shiva signals the coming liberation from samsara into moksha, or enlightenment. This and other small portable images of Shiva were not created to sit in museums. They were and still are dressed in fine regalia and paraded through the streets during festivals. While Hindus do not believe that a temple image is actually a god, they do believe that the god may inhabit that image for some periods. So, a temple image will be gently awakened in the morning, will receive gifts of food and flowers, and will be ritually bathed. A statue of a god or goddess that has been transformed in a special ceremony by an enlightened guru into a living presence of that deity is an important focal point for worship in a temple ceremony or worship before a small household shrine. What's so intriguing about the notion of darshan is that the worshiper not only sees the god in the image, but is seen by the god in return. So we may need to move on to Hindu temples, but first I want to talk briefly about the lost wax bronze casting technique, which was used to make the Hellenistic boxer and the African sculpture we will encounter next unit. I ran out of time in Unit 3. Basically, an artist makes a wax mold of the image. This is carefully packed into clay or plaster, which is allowed to dry, and then hot metal is poured into the mold through a hole at the top. The metal melts the wax and takes its place, conforming to the sculpted shape. The artist then pounds off the dry clay or plaster and finishes the image with fine tools. On to temples. India is filled with Hindu temples of varying styles. Lakshmana Temple is a northern-style temple with tall, fluted towers that imitate sacred mountains. It's part of a famous complex of temples built by a dynasty that ruled central India from the 9th to the 13th century. Khajuraho was their first capital, and the massive building program these rulers undertook was designed both to gain the gods' favor for the rulers and to demonstrate their piety and their wealth and power. So let's watch an introduction to Hindu temples created by the Asian Art Museum. The College Board hasn't given us a lot of guidance about which of these terms you need to know, but I think it would be smart to remember that the Garbha Griha, which means womb chamber, is the inner sanctum where the image of the god resides. Basically, it's the temple's equivalent of a cella, but much more dark and hidden. Directly above the divine images of the Garbha Griha is the imagined axis of the world that links the center of the earth to the human realms and above them to the heavens. This axis mundi, travels upward through the Garbha Griha's towering roof, which is called a shikara. Smaller towers cover the mandapas or hypostyle halls leading to the Garbha Griha. Each of these towers symbolizes the cosmic mountain. Note that the structure is elevated on a platform or plinth. That's like the stylobate of a Greek temple. Here's pretty much the same set of labels, this time on a photograph. And here is a helpfully labeled floor plan. The space labeled sanctum is the Garbha Griha. It is a small space, often a perfect square, windowless and enclosed. Unlike the rest of the temple, it has no ornamentation. The womb space represents universal essence. Worshippers walk around or circumnambulate the image, seeing and being seen again in that act of darshan. The mandapas are the rooms leading toward the inner sanctum. Often they have internal pillars, that is, they are hypostyle halls. Note again that the smaller towers rise over the entry halls. Here's how one scholar explains the artistic and spiritual logic behind Hindu temple design. A Hindu temple is built around the belief that all things are one, everything is connected. So the pilgrim is welcomed through mathematically structured spaces, a network of art, pillars, and carvings and statues that display and celebrate the four important and necessary principles of human life: the pursuit of artha, prosperity or wealth, the pursuit of kama, pleasure, including sensual pleasure, the pursuit of dharma, virtue, the ethical life, and finally the pursuit of moksha, release, self-knowledge, enlightenment. So let's return to our video, which relates the form of the temple to its religious function. Here's the approach to the Garbha Griha and the Lakshmana Temple. Note the hypostyle design of the mandapa. And here we see a plan for the wider temple area. Note that there is a central temple surrounded by 4 smaller shrines. Now the term Pachayatana caught me by surprise when it showed up on one of the College Board questions from this unit. I'd never encountered it before, and I didn't see it in any of the readings. But the term refers to a temple design where a central temple or shrine is surrounded by 4 smaller shrines. Now we both know. Does this design remind you of any of the other temples we've studied? So, the temple on top is the Temple of Amun-Re at Karnak. Note that it has the same essentially rectilinear structure, where the worshiper is drawn through pillared hallways into an ever darker inner space. In both temples, the design reflects and reinforces a spiritual journey toward the god. So what's another similarity? Think about power and authority. Both temples were built by powerful rulers to bolster their claim to hold the favor of the gods and to demonstrate the ruler's devotion to the gods, both important elements of legitimacy. And yes, this really is a College Board image, don't blame me. But also don't assume that these erotic sculptures meant that this was the Chandala king's version of the Playboy Mansion. Let's watch another video clip which explains the religious significance of these carvings. Shilpa Shastras are Hindu texts that lay out rules for artists and craftsmen. They include rules about perfect proportions for buildings and for sculptures for the human body. So we have another canon, right? As the quote indicates, the images of loving couples were part of an iconography promoting spiritual achievement in all phases of life. The Chandala kings were also heavily influenced by tantric philosophies, which divided the cosmos into male and female principles. Interestingly, while men were viewed as having form and potential, an essentially passive role, it was women who were viewed as possessing the active energy that brought the world into being. Their mutual cooperation and joining was necessary for existence. As your reading pointed out, the bodies are not entirely naked. They are always adorned. The fighting lion is the symbol of the Chandala dynasty. Note that the lion appears to be winning. The Chandala claim to be descended from the union between God and mortal woman. Shades of the Greeks. At any rate, these temples are clearly a statement about power as well as piety.